The market revolution occurred between the 1790s to the mid-1800s. The first objective for this lecture is to understand the market revolution is a development that causes economic and social changes in America. And those economic changes will influence social and cultural changes. All of those changes are advanced by innovations in transportation. The second objective is to understand the market revolution influences westward expansion and American freedoms, who can pursue their happiness and who cannot. And the third objective is to understand the market revolution influences changes in religion. This is a picture of a symbol by the name of Columbia. And this picture represents a message, and that message is that America expanded westward. In this picture, you can see Columbia holding a school book. You can see settlers moving west. You can see telegraph wires, etc. This was all about expanding west. This westward expansion was called Manifest Destiny. And Manifest Destiny was the idea that America has a divine right to expand westward, to spread democracy and American ideals. Thomas Jefferson saw expanding westward as expanding an agrarian and self-sufficient society. He felt that America was going to be built on the backs of farmers. During the market revolution, there are economic changes. America moves from a home economy to a manufacturing economy. A home economy is where products are made at home, that the family was involved in making products. For example, women in the family would make quilts at home. They would actually have looms and weave them, while the men might be out chopping wood. But all members of the family contributed to the home economy. They may use the products they make for self-sufficiency, or they may barter those at the local mercantile. But this changes to a manufacturing economy where goods were made in a factory and made on a larger scale. Another economic change was a switch from artisan labor to wage labor. And artisan labor consisted of a hierarchy. It was a master and apprentice relationship. An apprentice was someone who worked for someone who was a master of their trade. So an apprentice was generally a young man of a lower socioeconomic status who would go work for someone who was highly skilled in a particular trade, for example, a shoemaker. So this young man would go work for a shoemaker. That shoemaker would take them in, provide them food and shelter, but not pay them wages. But in exchange, this apprentice would learn a skill over the course of 10, 20 years, and then become an independent artisan themselves. And this wasn't just shoemakers, it was seamstresses, tailors, a number of different types of trades. But with the emergence of factories during the market revolution, that's going to switch to wage labor. So instead of, for example, shoes being made by artisan, the shoes are being manufactured on a larger scale in a factory. And they would hire people to come work in the factory, and you'd be paid a wage. A social change that occurs during the market revolution is the switch from Republican motherhood to the cult of domesticity. Republican motherhood was the role that women played in society after the American Revolution. Their role in society was to raise good American citizens. The role was also to take care of the family, take care of the home. But during the Market Revolution, it's going to switch over to something called the cult of domesticity. And the cult of domesticity was not that different from Republican motherhood, except the cult of domesticity gave women a very defined role during the Market Revolution, or during the 1800s. Women would stay home, take care of the children, cook, clean, take care of their husband, while the men generally worked in some capacity. They might go out and be a wage laborer at the factory, or they might work on a farm, but it was no longer the family working together in a home economy. It was very defined roles. And it was thought that women were incapable of being independent, that women were dependent on men. Another social change was that women and children worked in factories and textile mills. So you will start to see mostly young girls moving away from farms to urban areas where these factories are located. And this caused an influx of young girls to these cities or urban areas. But it was usually temporary until they got married. So this was not their goal in life to work at these factories, it was to get married. Now, this is a social change because usually what happened was that these young girls grew up, say, on a farm. They would meet a young man, they would get married, they would stay at home, raise children, take care of the household. And this influx into these factories was changing all of that. This is an advertisement from the Lowell factory, and the intent of this advertisement is to get labor. They needed labor in these factories. And so they needed to convince both the single young women to work in the factory and to persuade their parents to let them move to a city to work in a factory. Because there was this concern about the morality of young women moving away in a city alone. Because there's young men there and so forth. So if you notice in this advertisement, it's presented as the factory is a good place to be, that these cities with these factories will not influence the moral character of young women. You have greenery around here with a honeybee hive, which symbolizes sweetness. You have a picture of a church back here. You can see the steeple. You have the young girl carrying books. You don't quite know if those are school books. That's likely school books. Could be something related to church. You really don't know here. But so the intent of this advertisement was to entice these young women to the factories as well as persuade their parents, like I mentioned. Another social and economic change caused by the emergence of factories was that young men could now make a choice on whether to work in a factory or as an apprentice. This is a photograph of a master shoemaker. This is more of a modern 20th century photograph, but it's similar to what was occurring in the 1800s. So you could work as an apprentice under a shoemaker, such as this one seen in the photograph. or you could choose to work in a shoemaking factory, such as the one illustrated here. There were two things appealing about working in a factory. First, in a factory, you could earn cash wages every week, so you had an instant income, as opposed to being an apprentice, where you wouldn't see an income for quite some time. And the second, it freed young men from a system of hierarchy. A young man could decide to be independent right away instead of working for 20 years to become a master. And kind of a downside of factory work was that it didn't prepare individuals to become independent. So as an apprentice, you would eventually become a master tradesman and become independent and earn your own way. But in a factory, you were reliant on the factory owners and the factory managers, so they really called the shots. You could have a job one day and not have a job the next day. Another social change caused by the emergence of factories was it changed the way people perceived time. People started working according to the rhythms of the clock. So if you're a master tradesman, then you kind of make your own hours. You get up when you choose to get up. You go to work when you choose to go to work. You make the number of shoes that you choose to make, and then you quit working whenever you decide to do so. But in a factory job, you were expected to be there at a certain time, and you were expected to leave at a certain time, and you really didn't have any control over that. And for any of you who've worked in factories or just worked on a time clock in general, would understand that. Another both economic and social change here is this movement from self-sufficiency to dependency. The more dependent they became on employers, the more power employers had. It gave employers more power over a class of people. Employers had power to determine wages, hours, and whether to end employment, like I mentioned earlier. And ending employment creates no way for the people to support themselves. And this is eventually the reason that labor unions will develop. And just to give you an indication of how bad things were in these factories, unions were fighting for a 60-hour work week. That was in the 19th century, in the 1800s. It was common for workers to work 75 to 90 hours a week and 12.5 to 15 hours of work a day. In 1800, 16% of all American workers, that's 1 in 16, are wage workers. By 1860, 40% of Americans were wage earners. This is a significant economic change that caused a social change. The bigger story is the transportation revolution. Before 1815, it cost as much to send a ton of goods across the Atlantic as it did to manage a ton of goods over 30 miles of land. The opportunity to get wealthy increased because of innovations in transportation. The transportation revolution connected the eastern side of America to the western side of America. When I say the western side of America, I mean the Louisiana Territory, which America acquired in the early part of the 1800s. The transportation revolution improved communication between the eastern side of America and the western side of America. Prior to the transportation revolution, most people communicated through sending letters. So it might take a letter from the eastern side of America a couple of weeks or even months to get to the western side of America. The transportation revolution improved the amount of time it took. It shortened that time. The transportation revolution also improved business transactions between the eastern side of America and the western side of America. It was faster to send goods back and forth between the two sides. The transportation revolution made it easier to travel to the western side of America to visit family members. So if a family member lived in the eastern side of America, it would often take weeks or months to travel to the western side of America. But the transportation revolution improved that. The innovations in transportation included the Cumberland Road, canals, the railroads, and steamboats. The Cumberland Road was not quite a paved road, but it was a road that was resurfaced with stones. So in other words, what roads generally looked like were dirt or kind of rough grass. There was no such thing as really paved roads. So travel was very difficult on roads. But with the Cumberland Road, it made it a little bit easier and faster. Steamboats helped improve travel on rivers. Rivers are often difficult to travel on because of the currents. And so steamboats made it faster for these boats to travel along the rivers, which made it faster for goods to get to one side of America to the other side. And it also made it easier for people to travel to one side of America to the other. Another innovation during the transportation revolution were canals. Canals are bodies of water that connect to larger bodies of water. For example, if you wanted to transport your goods around the world, you would have to load them on a wagon and the horse would take it to a port on the coast, and then you would load your goods onto a ship and it would travel to the rest of the world. With a canal, you could take your goods and put them on a boat, and then that boat would travel to the ocean, and then you could send your goods around the world. So it made it easier to transport goods and people. One of the most famous canals was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is in New York. It was constructed in 1815 and it opened in 1825. The canal was completed in 8 years and covered about 300 miles. It was referred to as Clinton's Ditch by the opponents of the Erie Canal. And Clinton was a New York City mayor who was a proponent of the Erie Canal. And the importance of the Erie Canal was that it revolutionized transportation in America. Between 1824 and 1825, there were 324 boats in New York Harbor. In 1836, there was approximately 1,241 boats in New York Harbor. This was crucial for changing the American economy and keeping the nation together. Communication and transportation were faster on the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal as well as other canals, improved transportation and communication between the East and the West. The canals linked the East and the West. The construction of the canal raised the question of how to balance public and individual interest. Is the individual harmed versus the common good? In other words, are the benefits of building the canal greater than the harm it caused individuals? This brought up the question of eminent domain. An eminent domain is when the government takes private property of an individual without the individual's consent. So the government may take someone's property to build a road or a dam, which is seen as a common good. And oftentimes the government will compensate a person for their property, but they don't always take in consideration the future value of someone's property. A local example of eminent domain is Petco Park in San Diego. And there was a big controversy over this, where they took some people's land by eminent domain to build a ballpark. And the question was whether the ballpark was seen as part of the common good. And I think they did compensate those property owners for their land, but there were some owners who had been there for quite a long time and were very upset over the building of Petco Park. An example of an eminent domain question during the construction of the Erie Canal was an issue of cutting down trees on a woman's property. Sarah Beeston, she was a New York property owner, and she was a widow, and she objected to the cutting down of her trees to build the canal. So the question was cutting down her trees of value? So ultimately, they can't really measure the value of trees. So it became an issue, and ultimately they do build the Erie Canal. So the canal also developed a division and a debate between commercial and agricultural classes. When I say the commercial classes, I mean the business people, the factory owners. And when I say the agricultural classes, I mean the farmers. The businessmen argued that they needed subsidies from the government to prosper. Their prosperity would create economic opportunities for everyone. It would create jobs, new businesses, etc. Meaning, if you have people building the canal, well, those people need, equipment. They need clothes. They need a place to live. They need a place to eat. Those type of things. Farmers argued that the state was obligated to sustain their own property. So, in other words, they didn't want their property taken to build the Erie Canal and to have this factory town develop around the Erie Canal. So the farmers felt that it threatened their rights to be self-sufficient. In other words, the farmers were going to be dependent on the businessman for sufficiency instead of being dependent on their own farms for self-sufficiency. Another innovation were the railroads. Initially, there was about 30,000 miles of rail in America, and that will expand tremendously throughout the 1800s. The railroads stimulated coal and iron production. It stimulated coal production because railroads ran on steam, and coal helps make steam. And it stimulated iron production because the rails are made out of iron. The railroads, like the canals, helped keep the nation together. It linked eastern side of America to the western side of America. So it improved travel and communication between East and West. Other innovations included the telegraph. The telegraph improved communication between the East and the West, and it linked the East and the West. So the way the telegraph worked was that you would have a telegraph office in your city or town, and then you would have a telegraph operator in those offices. So if you wanted to send a telegram to someone, you would go into a telegraph office and you would give your message to the telegraph operator. They would use Morse code. The Morse code would be sent over wires to another telegraph office. The telegraph operator in that office would receive that message and then write it down and give that message to the recipient. So it was instant communication. Not only personal communication, but business communication. It helped improve businesses. You could do contracts over the telegraph. You could send newspapers over the telegraph. So people in the West would know what was happening on the East Coast a lot sooner than they would have prior to that. Another innovation was the cotton gin. The cotton gin was a mechanism that separated the seed from cotton, which was normally a very tedious task done by slaves. But the cotton gin revolutionized the South, and it made cotton the number one crop in the South, and eventually the world. The cotton gin increased slavery. Now, you normally think that it would decrease slavery because it's taking the place of slaves, but it doesn't. Because what the cotton gin does is it increases the production of cotton. So, with the increase of the production of cotton, they recognize that they needed more land so they could make more of a profit from cotton. So, they will start to expand westward, particularly in the Southwest. And it increases slavery because if they have more land they needed worked, then they needed more slaves. And by this time, they had domestic slavery and not the Atlantic slave trade anymore. So it expands domestic slavery westward. The market revolution improved the lives of many people. It improved the lives of people who wanted to move west. It now made it easier for them to move west. It improved businesses. It improved communications. It improved the amount of work that was available for many people. You need people to build the railroads, and you need people to build the factories. But there were people who were not benefiting during the market revolution. Of course, one being the slaves and the other being free blacks. Free blacks were excluded from upward mobility caused by the market revolution. Free blacks couldn't be factory managers. They were on the low rung of labor. They were not given employment. Poor whites were given employment, but free blacks were not, because free blacks were seen as competition for poor whites. So free blacks were often hired in menial and unskilled positions. And in fact, free blacks were barred from access to Western land by federal law. That will eventually change to some degree, but at first, that's the way it was. As for the relationship between the market revolution and religion, what I'm mainly talking about is the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening occurs in the 1830s in the heart of the Market Revolution. It occurred in New York and expanded outward. But before I talk about the Second Great Awakening, I want to give you a little historical context about religion and the founding of the American government. The American government was founded before the Second Great Awakening. So when the founding fathers were setting up the government, when they refer to religion, what they're talking about is morality and virtue, and not evangelical religion. The founders were suspicious of evangelical religion. They thought evangelical religion was irrational. The founders thought of God as a presence that set everything in motion. Many of the founding fathers subscribed to the Enlightenment, which was about natural law. But there were some founding fathers that were deists, and deists believed that God was hands off, that there were no miracles, that God basically wound up a clock and let everything go, and everything happened the way it was going to happen. The founders distinguished evangelical religion because it was passionate and not rational thinking. Remember, the Enlightenment was about logic. The founders were not involved in the First Great Awakening. Thomas Jefferson was very young during the First Great Awakening. So the First Great Awakening is unlikely to have strongly influenced the founding fathers. So the founding fathers were really focused on morality and virtue when they set up the government. Moral virtue was directly related to civic virtue. The idea was to create a nation which every citizen was concerned about their own well-being and others' well-being, and that people were respectful of others. The Second Great Awakening was basically the First Great Awakening, just on a larger scale. There were large numbers of individuals undergoing conversions, large revival meetings, democratic evangelical style of preaching. Anyone could stand up and preach the Word of God. You didn't have to be an intellectual elite to do so. They preached to the people's hearts, not to God's wrath, this personal relationship with God. They followed the teachings of Jesus Christ. And they had a hostility towards the intellectual elite. And there were new churches formed out of the Second Great Awakening. With the First Great Awakening, you had basically the Baptist and the Methodist. But with the Second Great Awakening, you have more Baptist, more Methodist, and other types of religions. For example, you have the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was called the Mormon Church. This was born in New York, and it was founded by a gentleman by the name of Joseph Smith, who would later be persecuted, and the Mormons will move out west with Brigham Young. But the Second Great Awakening has a profound effect on America. For one, we have a lot more churches as a result of the Second Great Awakening. We will also start to see a change in the way people looked at slavery. There will start to be more of a push towards abolition, and the Second Great Awakening will influence that push for abolition. They will start to be questioning the morality of slavery. The women's rights movement will influence or be influenced by the Second Great Awakening. They will start to see there's something wrong with the way they are being treated, that it was immoral for the way that they were being treated. They will start to see that prisoners were being treated immorally. But the Second Great Awakening will become the fabric of American society. It will be part of this new, young, progressive republic. This evangelical movement was looked upon as being progressive and new. And those who subscribe to it will not be welcoming of religions such as Catholicism. During the 1800s, we will start to have immigrants move in, particularly from places like Ireland, who were Catholic, and Catholic was seen as the old way. And evangelicalism is seen as the new way. So there's going to be conflict there. Right, so this ends the lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.